think it was, that said, when you're on the field, take the game very seriously. And as soon as you leave the field, forget about the game altogether. That's a bit like being a therapist. You know, when you're in there with your client, particularly if you're talking about something very solemn like grief or trauma, like a football player, you take it very seriously. But when you're off the field, there is a need to let go of what happened so that you're fresh for the next client or fresh for whatever you've got going on after work. Sometimes we are very affected by our work and the stories that we hear. I'm sure journalists are the same, and podcast producers, and and writers, we're all human. You've just got to have ways to cope with getting a little bit too affected or too attached to your clients, because you're wearing a professional hat. You've got to stay in that role.
Alrighty, welcome everyone to the Getting Mental podcast, where I'm attempting to go live Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So far it hasn't worked out, but we're getting there. And today we're joined by Dr. Rachel. Is it Hannam? Is that the right pronunciation?
That's the right pronunciation.
Lovely. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Luke. How are you?
I'm feeling nervous actually as well.
Okay, good. That makes two of us. Let's be nervous
Wonderful.
together.
So I came across you online, and you have a lot of experience, by a lot I think over 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, in the space of psychology.
About 20 years, yeah.
Okay, 20 plus years. And what appealed to me was your vast experience in psychology, and I just wanted to, I guess, discuss and go into how you came into this journey as a psychologist, and maybe then after that we can go through what you've learned and what you've seen as a psychologist and some life advice maybe.
Great. Okay, so that sounds good. So the first thing was, how did I end up being a psychologist?
Yeah, so maybe just the genesis of why you decided to do that.
Okay. Yeah, well, 100 years ago when I was in high school, I really wanted to
so there was dinosaurs, right?
I really wanted to get into performing arts, and I did theatre and musicals and all sorts of things in high school, and I didn't end up getting to the auditions because I ended up overseas. But that was okay, because my second preference had been to study psychology. And the link I see between dramatic arts and psychology, for me anyway, was that I was always really interested in the characters' motivations in stage plays and films. So for me, there's still that link. You know, I love films and shows where the characters are complex and you're wondering about their motivations and stuff. So I didn't end up in performing arts. I did end up in psychology because my mother had given me a lot of self-help books to read when I was a teenager, which I'll always be grateful to her for. So my journey of reading psychology and self-help stuff started at around 14, which is younger than a lot of people. I did my undergrad in psych, and then I realized that I have to do 6 years of study, and I was a bit sick of study. So I decided to go overseas. I did the backpacking thing, and then I wanted to get a job, but a professional one. And someone said, do a 1-year grad dip ed and become a teacher. That looked like a logical step across from psychology. And I became a primary school teacher. I really didn't like it. I was a square peg in a round hole in that career. But that was my motivation to go back and do the extra years of study. So I didn't get registered as a psychologist till I was 29. I ended up doing a PhD in psychology, where I looked at professional burnout in teachers because I had been a teacher. So I had some connections to get my data. And then in 2012, I started my private practice with another psychologist here in Brisbane, Australia. And 12 years later, we've gone from having 2 of us to 46 of us.
46, you said?
Yeah, we have 46 practitioners. Most of them are psychologists, and we've got a
Mm.
few mental health social workers and a couple of counselors. So I've grown my business, my practice from two clinicians to 46 clinicians in 12 years. It's been
So what's it
massive.
like managing clinicians? Is it like a psychology sit down every time there's a problem?
Um, Mostly, I really enjoy doing supervision. And I'm
Hmm.
not just saying that because some of my colleagues might watch this later, but I
Yeah.
really like these days, having been a psych for 20 years or so, I really
Mm.
enjoy sharing my knowledge and experience. And I think the clinicians who come to me for supervision appreciate that I'm real and authentic, and I'll tell them about the mistakes that I've made. And
Hmm.
like, I'm so far removed from the academic world now after all
Mm.
these years that I'll make it very real world and practical and authentic and lighthearted, which I think we have to do because humor is a great defense mechanism given the heaviness that our job
Oh yeah.
sometimes involves. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's fascinating what you said about drama and the characters and then relating to
Mm.
psychology. There's actually some studies that I've seen that when someone reads fiction and makes them better with social skills, or that's the wrong way to phrase it, improves their social skills. There's, hang on one second, let me share my screen here. There's this article here I was just reading recently. Let me just get this up. Hang on. This one here, reading fiction may enhance social skills. Now, I know that
Yeah.
psychology isn't just about social skills, but the reason they laid out in this article here is that basically what it does is it it helps you to discover and understand someone's motives and someone's reasons
Yes.
behind doing things. And
Yes.
in books specifically, I mean, they're way, you spend usually days or weeks reading the book, so you have this kind of psychological back and forth. Like, say for example, reading Dostoevsky, where you're reading about these people and how they did this thing and that thing. So I imagine being a psychologist, you can't get too attached to patients, otherwise you want to control it and motivate them to do a certain thing and have your own objective. So I suppose it's a very useful skill to also see it as a fiction novel, I imagine, in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. I'll look up that article later. There's this
Mm.
great quote um, from Hemsley, I think it was, that said, when you're on the field, take the game very seriously. And as soon as you leave the field, forget about the game altogether. And that's a nice, I only read that this morning actually in James Clear's email newsletter. And I thought that's a bit like being a therapist. When you're in there with your client, particularly if you're talking about something very solemn like grief or trauma, like a
Hmm.
football player, you take it very seriously. But when you're off the field, there is a need to let go of what happened so that you're fresh for the next client or fresh for whatever you've got going on after work. And so you're right to say about getting too close to your clients. However, having said that, we're human. And I just did a supervision session with an early career psychologist before jumping online with you. I told her a story about a client whose story um, both made me cry, but also I wanted to go and like track down the perpetrator who had traumatized her. Like I had a very human reaction to my client's story. Now, that doesn't happen very often, but my point to my colleague was sometimes we are very affected by our work and the stories that we hear. I'm sure journalists are the same, and podcast producers, and like and writers, we're all human. You've just got to have ways to cope with getting a little bit too affected or too attached to your clients because yeah, you're wearing a professional hat. You've got to stay in that role.
When also in life as well. And there's this, I don't know if it's a quote, but a story of what's the book called? There's this book about someone that writes the stories and interviews the German soldiers that did what they did to the Jews, and they
Yes.
wrote from their perspective.
Yeah.
And the kind of takeaway is that we often, so, and another example is, let's say we're in a room full of 100 people and someone says in the front, if you were in World War II, would you be would you be the guy from Schindler's List, where you help the Jews escape, or would you be the person that's the guard at the jail or the at the camp? And everyone's like, oh, I'd be Schindler's List. I'm like, we well, you wouldn't, right? People often underassume their
Mm.
ability to fall to the masses. And I had a very
Yeah.
interesting experience with this recently, and with the whole stuff in America going on with the Republicans and Democrats and Harris and Trump. And I have zero interest in telling you who I may or may not be going for, because I don't want to have a debate about it because it's so tense.
Yeah.
But I heard someone saying something about one of the candidates, and I thought to myself, hang on a second, am I saying that about the person that I might be supporting? And do I have those biases and those ways of seeing things for the person that I'm supporting? And it's like, well, they're doing
Yeah.
the same thing in reverse. And then it just made me think about how, and I'm going a bit of a tangent here, but made me think about so much about how you almost need to see science or values as your guiding compass. Otherwise, who you are will be compromised by the things that you think are right and the biases that
Oh,
you hold.
I
And then it
agree.
reminded me of Carl Sagan and in his book around science as a tool, right? And people might say, well, there's this science stuff that's wrong about this and that, but it's a guiding path to something that will eventually be right. That's the kind of mechanism for it. And it
Exactly.
forces you to think critically. And I was just thinking so much about lately about how many things do I think that are right, and I think that I'm in the right position, even with fights with my partner, or
Yeah.
situations where with a friend I'm like they did wrong by me, this and that. How much of those situations have I distorted in my mind, and have I biased? And how much globally are those things going on? And what tools should we use to really get out of that? And then my solution was science.
Mm. I agree. And critical thinking and curiosity, because the correct answer to the question of would you have been this person or this person is I don't know. I don't know. Because everything that we experience in a way is phenomenological. It arises out of the context. It's dependent on all the variables, the field conditions around us. So you don't know what you would have done if you were someone else or if you were in a different situation. And that don't know, that not knowing, is open mindedness, it's curiosity, and it's critical thinking, as you say. And I'm really passionate about this too, Luke, because so often in my therapeutic work, I'm talking to people about sitting with not knowing and tolerating ambiguity. And the ego, of course, wants to know because the ego is about our identity. So, I identify with this position or this party or this thing or whatever. But also, it gives us a sense of certainty. So, thinking we know reduces anxiety.
Hmm.
But we're very wise to tolerate not knowing and sitting with that anxiety and being with the uncertainty and learning how to stay with that because otherwise we make decisions um, not based on our intuition.
Mm.
We haven't really got to a place where we have true and deep conviction about something because we're still in process. And I could tell you a really quick story. I follow a podcast on YouTube called Heretics. Heretics. I don't know if
Hmm.
you've heard of this guy.
Is that from the basis of a book by Daniel Carmen? Is it heuristics? Do you mean or heretics?
I no heretics. So this guy on YouTube interviews people who are sort of modern day heretics who are a bit anti-establishment or say stuff that you're not really supposed to say.
Right. Okay.
Um, and he interviewed this detransitioner the other day, who
Interesting stuff.
the bit that I'm quite interested in this whole gender identity politics stuff. Yeah, that's the guy,
Mm,
and Andrew Gold, and
right.
so we interviewed this man who was in his late 30s and went through gender reassignment surgery at about the age of 30, so he was an adult. And he
Hmm.
tells this story of, he said ultimately he was a gay man and he had OCD. And if I've treated people with obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's a
Hmm.
very difficult disorder to treat because it's a brain disorder. Like it's up there with all the other it's a form of neurodivergence. So it's brain based. It's really tricky. but they didn't pick up on his OCD. And the gender therapist, which is what he called it, even the day before the surgery, which was to remove his penis and create a false vagina. I hope I'm allowed to say these words on your podcast.
Yes, of course.
The gender therapist said the day before the surgery, when the patient was saying, I'm not sure about this, I'm feeling very anxious about this surgery, the therapist said, you are the perfect candidate for this surgery, which the therapist had said previously, and the doctors had deemed that this man was a perfect candidate for gender reassignment surgery as a way to fix his dysphoria. But they didn't realize he had OCD because they hadn't done a thorough enough history and clinical examination. So he went through, and even on the day of the surgery, he reports to Andrew Gold that he was in panic and he thought he was doing the wrong thing. And just that little piece of that podcast, of that story of the therapist saying, you're a perfect candidate for this surgery, shows that how easy it is in the field conditions that I mentioned before for one person who's got the perceived power and authority, credibility, to influence the thinking and suppress critical thinking, but suppress intuitive thinking, listening to deeper feelings. And they did not encourage this patient and many other patients I've met who've got gender dysphoria. They didn't help them sit with that not knowing and that ambiguity. Like, I don't really know what's going to help me. And the end of that story of that man was that he regretted it and he wished he'd never done it. And in hindsight, he could see that he was not diagnosed properly, didn't get the right treatments. And it's such an extreme, I'm telling that story because it's such an extreme example of critical thinking going out the window, tolerating not knowing, going out the window, holding space and being patient until the right answer maybe comes along. And it doesn't always, but sometimes it does. And sometimes it takes a long time. And kind of containing him and applying critical thinking and curiosity. He was not encouraged to do that. He was told, you're the perfect candidate. And I thought, what a tragic and clear, extreme example of the lack of critical thinking that still exists, even in such an important area like medicine.
Well, even the absence of just making a decision, not so much critical thinking around, sit and question these things more deeply, but just pause and see what's going on. And it comes back to contemplation, right? Like there's also, I think, been studies done as well around how, as humans in Western civilization, we aren't spending enough time in the space of boredom, and then therefore we contemplate in order to reach emotions or conclusions like compassion. Rather than knee-jerk reaction of like people pleasing, but rather compassion is a long process. It's a long, lengthy process of, why is that person that way? Like same with reading a book, right? Like over the space of a month, you might read a 600-page fiction book and you're like, this person's the bad person. Then you hear about their story and then reverse and flip it and then look on how that applies to your life. It's the same thing with compassion. It's like, why do I feel, and with intuition, it's like, why do I feel this way about this situation? And then going down that feeling. And I do this all the time where I'm just like constantly on my phone doing things, working. And next thing you know, I'm just down this rabbit hole and I've lost the capacity to contemplate.
That's such a good point. Contemplation, compassion has a much slower pace than judgment. Is something I often say. Compassion is slow. That's kind of what you're saying too. It requires contemplation and time before you can get the full picture, curiosity, all of these things. You're right. They require time, space, and contemplation. And what you made me think of as you were talking, Luke, is because social media is so fast, how you can scroll so fast, our phones and our technology. Like, I'm 48 and I grew up in a time where we had to wait for the internet to dial into the phone line and we wait like 5 minutes before you remember that too. The internet would take the little, yeah, buzzy. It was very
Yeah,
noisy. And
yeah.
eventually, the internet would appear on your computer, and it
Like,
was
wow.
it was pretty slow. Web pages were quite slow to load. I know occasionally that still happens, but we all get so cross when that happens. The pace both of change, but of how quickly our tech can function. I think there's a really big downside to this. Massive downside is we're not doing what you've described. And I love that you read books because it's slow.
Well, it's getting harder and harder. And that's because I'm consciously choosing, again, responsibility. I'm taking the action of choosing to use my phone a lot. But I'm noticing the more that I do this, the more that I watch YouTube videos. And so, what a lot of people in my generation do, so millennials, they will, and I'm speaking for not everyone, but just those who, hear this and say, oh, I do that. But what I've seen a lot of people do is they will have YouTube open and then make dinner and then also sit on the toilet watching YouTube videos and then brush their teeth. I don't know it's a toilet thing because I'm not there with them.
I
I'm
I'm not a
speaking for myself.
millennial, and I have done this too.
There you go. So maybe it's just people in general. But what
I
it
think
leads
it's
to, in my
pretty,
opinion, is
yeah.
just this constant attention where your threshold for entertainment is so high that when you pick up this paper or Kindle, you're like, oh, like this is just so boring and I don't want the feeling of boredom. And it just leads to this rabbit hole of constantly needing something to feel okay.
Oh, I could not agree with you more, Luke. And it's so hard
Perfect
to.
timing for that siren, by the way.
Yeah, I live near a main road in Brisbane. Um,
Uh,
my best friend is a psychiatrist, which is obviously different to a psychologist, and she and I have talked about this. And she works with teenagers and young adults, so she totally agrees and sees what you've just described. And we are going away next month for 6 days to a house that we're renting in a place that has
mm,
no phone reception and no internet, to give ourselves 5 days of complete digital detox, and just walk and read books and make fires and make food, just like people used to do. And we feel like we have to do that just to manage our own compulsions. I think it affects every age group who uses technology.
so, what do you think the solution is? What have you seen with patients and people that you work with, and what solutions might there be if you have any?
Well, so I'm a big believer in that we're all a part of the collective psyche. So I think there
Mm,
are collective phenomena. Meme, the original idea of a meme was not a picture on the internet, but a meme was an idea that was contagious.
from
And I
Jung, right?
think, well, actually, Susan Blackmore, I believe, coined the term meme. And she said that ideas were like genes. She said something like, she wrote the book The Meme Machine before I think even the internet was like really popular. And her thesis was, people don't have ideas, ideas have people, that ideas are like genetics and they just kind of propagate. And that was
Oh,
just sort
wow.
of her idea, but people took the word meme on, and I think it's Susan Blackmore. It's been a long time
Yeah, I can see
since
it
I
here.
read it, but and that's where we get the word meme from. She coined that because it sounds like the word gene, but it's
Mm,
meme, and that we spread ideas, and
mm,
that we're part of this collective psyche, and that's a
mm.
Jungian idea, and it's very difficult to break free from the collective psyche. So that's why I think it doesn't matter if you're 48 or 28 or 14. We're all kind of potentially susceptible to this fast-paced, reactive tech addiction. Um, but I kind of have some hope because I hear of other things trending, which are around slowing down, going
Hmm.
back to low tech ways of living in certain respects. Um, making our technology less attractive. I heard this morning about the trend of being demure. I don't know if you've heard of this
Yeah, I've seen
online.
that. Yeah, yeah, of course I have.
And I'm like, oh, of course, yeah. Well, I hadn't, and I was like, what is that about? And it seems to be like a compensatory reaction in the States to this idea of like extreme extroversion, putting everything
Hmm.
out there all the time.
Very
It's a
American.
very American thing, but we do it in Australia as well. Like, people are just so addicted to social media. They're posting stuff and it's very showy sometimes. And this
Mm.
idea of being demure is sort of like a reaction against that. It's only
Hmm.
one of the compensatory things I've seen happening, but I guess I get hope that there's, some critical thinking that some people are starting to apply to what we're doing and how we're living. And with that critical thinking, maybe develops a movement that,
Mm.
guards against um, this, phenomenon we're talking about of compulsive, fast paced use of tech.
Well, the good thing about critical thinking is it's not based in an ideology, meaning that it's not, as far as I know, it's not based in ideology of like, oh, this is a left leaning principle or right leaning principle. It's just purely, okay, you have
Mm,
your views, you have your beliefs, but
yes.
what's the logic of this, right? And then also at the same time as well, some people might listen to this thinking, okay, so when I have a fight with my partner, I'm going to be logical. It's like, depends who you're dating. Sometimes you need to make space for just being emotional as well. But I think in that, critical thinking is the key.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess the question maybe is, how do you do it? How do you
Mm.
not get swept up in an ideology? How do you not
Mm.
get swept up in, because we all have a need to belong and we all want identity, particularly younger adults and teenagers. Identity is the developmental task at the top of the pile of developmental tasks.
Mm.
So this is why what's known as psychiatric epidemics affect young adults and particularly
The
young
most.
women and teenage girls the most. Throughout all of human history, the most susceptible section of the population to psychic epidemics, and I think that the transgender thing is a psychiatric epidemic because most of the patients in youth gender clinics are females, and a lot of
Contentious.
them have autism. Well, we just need to look
Mm.
at the stats. Around 80% of patients in youth
Think
gender
critically.
clinics, I'm
Mm.
differentiating here, youth gender clinics, about 80% are female, biological female, and a big chunk of them have neurodivergence. And they're, across history, they're the ones who've been susceptible because they don't feel like they fit in. They struggle with their self-concept and with their relationship with their body and with others. And there's so
They're
many
neurotic.
examples. Yeah, and I was a teenage girl once. It's quite awful in some ways to be a teenage girl. Your body
Or a teenager in
changes
general.
so
Yeah.
much. Teenagers in general. The thing for girls, though, is that the hormones are even more extreme in what they're doing to our bodies because we're getting ready to make a whole other human
Yeah.
being with our bodies. And the changes we have to go through to make our bodies ready to make another person are so violent internally sometimes that no wonder teenage girls, are crazy and they do suffer. And but that makes them, I love working with teenagers. It makes them really vulnerable, right? And
Yeah, they're very
like
emotionally
I
open.
and emotionally open, but also very susceptible and vulnerable. So,
Mm.
and vulnerable to being swept up in sort of more simplistic ideological thinking. And I know they teach critical thinking in schools these days,
Mm.
but like, how do you really inspire critical thinking? Because what happens
Hmm.
is then people a movement develops out of critical thinking. So we started to question gender role stereotypes, and I'm all for
Mm.
questioning gender role stereotypes and sexuality stereotypes. Like, yeah, critical thinking, so important. But then the critical thinking gets to like a critical mass, and then it becomes an ideology. It's really
Mm.
interesting how that happens. And then we have to apply critical thinking to the ideology that developed out of previous critical thinking. I've seen this. And I think what we're not learning how to do is what we are talking about before, sitting with uncertainty, sitting with not knowing, and staying with ambiguity. And finding a way to contain and express our anxiety, but not repress it and not act it out. And that's something that I'm really passionate about as a psychologist, is staying with, expressing and containing our feelings, not repressing our feelings, and not acting them out if we can, if we can help it. So this, how do we relate to our emotions, is a big part of my work as a therapist.
And I feel also as well, it's understanding what are the most truths. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, right, there's a book by a social psychologist called The Social Animal. I believe it's Elliot Aronson. And in this
Mm-hmm.
book, he goes through some, I guess you say, truths, in my opinion, around humans and, the basis of who we are. And one of those principles is us versus them. And that since the beginning of time, there's always been an us
Tribal.
versus them mentality. Yeah, tribalism,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that it was necessary, in fact, compulsory for our survival. We're living in tribes of maximum 150 or so.
Mm.
Then we ought to protect that tribe and want to feel a part of it and see the other person as X, Y, Z, and see, like, highlight their negative attributes in order to survive, right? Now,
Mm.
there's I guess you could say, a counter movement towards this way of thinking in the spiritual community that I see, which is, humans at their core are enlightened and we're pure and we're loving, only those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we need to do is just step away. We need to meditate. We need to become enlightened. We need to move past the ego and suffering and do enough meditation. And humans by nature will become their source, which is love, compassion, care, naturally, at the absence of an ego, which is, hatred, division, all these kind of things. And
Tribalism.
personally, yeah,
Yeah.
and personally, I believe if you're going to throw out the concepts or the parts of who we are, not the concepts, sorry, the parts of who we are, in the belief that we are just something, I think we're actually doing ourselves a disservice. And the solution to think critically is to understand what is mostly the truth and build off those bases. So an example of that again is the us
Yeah.
versus them things. Let's go for an example of, let's say we
Mm.
fully acknowledge that we are tribalistic, right? Same thing, I'm assuming, in practice when you're dealing with someone who has a problem, the solution is to often admit that the problem is there, or at least consciously acknowledge that it exists. Okay, look, I do get angry, or yes, I do tend to do this, or yes, I do that. Even just consciously leads to the change, right? And speaking about the superconscious or the consciousness of all humans, once we acknowledge part of who we are, which is to not deny, which goes back to, I guess, shadow work in a way, or Carl Jung
Yes.
principles of bringing to light that which is dark, we're then able to move through that as a collective. So personally, I feel alongside critical thinking should live the act of acknowledging our nature globally,
Yeah.
or rather holistically and also individually.
I agree. I agree. I've studied nonviolent communication for about 20 years now, and the founder of that is Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, a psychologist who's since died a few years ago. He said something like, um, compassion is our true human nature. There wouldn't be so many of us. If compassion wasn't at our core and a big part of our nature, then we wouldn't have, because you need compassion to cooperate. You need
Is
compassion.
it
You
possible to
would have.
say compassion is one part of our human nature as opposed to the core?
Well, of course, humans can be very competitive. We can be violent. We can be aggressive, and these are survival strategies. But I guess he was making the point that under the kind of fight, flight, freeze survival strategies, we have a deeper survival strategy, which is compassion and cooperation. It's this idea of Buddha nature, that maybe you were touching on before. And, anthropologists have said something similar because they've found human skeletons. Maybe it's mentioned in the Social Animal book, where they've found 40, 50, 60,000-year-old skeletons which show broken leg bones that have healed, which suggests that somebody picked up, like, animals with
Took care
broken
of that.
legs. Yeah, animals with broken legs in the wild, they don't live long enough for that bone to heal most of the time, whereas humans have looked after each other. They would have had to carry that human with the broken leg and tended to them for six
Even
weeks or
Neanderthals did that as
whatever.
well, apparently.
Yeah, because it takes 6 weeks for a broken bone to heal, right? So if that happened,
Hmm.
someone was looking after that person. Um, and that's a uniquely human thing, and that's compassionate. So I agree
Yeah,
with you.
yeah. It's so funny because there's not funny but interesting how much is going on in the world currently, and I don't know if it's to do with the waves of how the world changes. So you look at some historical charts and the ups and downs of civilization. It just feels like there's just so much going on all at once right now.
Mm.
And there's almost like you can go back 100 years and see the patterns of things that are happening, not exactly 100 years, but I'm giving an example of a timeline where these things that are going on right now are very similar to then. And there's been a similar awakening or similar feeling in the culture. And so the compassion side of things, um, I wonder if the weaponization of compassion from certain ideological positions on both sides of the aisle are leading to actually the lack of compassion, which is the opposite, right? So I guess my point I'm making is that is the assumption of what compassion is
Mm.
destroying civilization as we know it, or is it is it actual compassion we need that we are having right now? Because I just feel like the compassion we have right now is not what actual compassion is.
Can you say
So, for
more
example,
about
you might,
that? Yeah.
yeah. So, an example is, so if you look at the, transgenderism, for example, right? Um, if you were to ask someone who's a part of that in group, they would say that these people feel gender dysphoria, and therefore the compassionate move from the individuals around them is to use pronouns, for example, he, them, whatever it might be, all the different pronouns. Then also at the same time that you should respect that, and it should be a part of, it should be accepted as part of the culture, right?
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say is that that to them is compassion. So
Mm.
I'm inquiring into what compassion actually is and isn't,
Ah,
because
that's
often
such a
you
good
use as a
question.
weapon. Mm,
Such a good question. Yeah, and the doctors doing surgeries on young adults and even teenagers, they think they're being compassionate, even though
correct.
some of these people are coming back 10 years later and saying, that doctor should not have done that. That wasn't compassionate because I should have been told to get more therapy or something. So I know what you're asking. And here's another example that I'm seeing. The language of mental health in kids and teenagers is sometimes making mental health problems worse. So we think we're being compassionate to, say, high school students or younger kids or university students when we write them letters of exemption and asking for special circumstances. And like I've done it, so I'm not criticizing therapists or school guidance counselors or doctors or anyone for supporting people with mental health struggles. It's my line of work. But I'm starting to critique whether or not the language of mental health is actually giving some people worse mental health. Like if you give a 9-year old the word anxiety or a label like ADHD, some of them will, because their brain hasn't finished developing, same with a 15-year old, some of them will over identify with the label to the point where it actually is not helpful to them. And then they end up um, using it as a way to wiggle out of responsibilities. And so, like, yeah, it's a really good question that you've posed. Are we really doing people, a compassionate service if we kind of go along with everything that is trending? Because mental health language really is trending in the last 10 to 15 years. Um, and I compare it to when I went to high school and nobody used the word anxiety and nobody had a diagnosis of ADHD and ASD. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but what I'm saying is there's been such change in the world of psychology and mental health as it plays out in the collective consciousness that it's fascinating, and we need to apply our critical thinking to that.
So where's the line then? I think that it's an awareness thing, meaning like this thing might exist and here it is as a diagnosis.
Mm.
But then how does, I guess, one where does the buck stop, so to speak, when it comes to, okay, I have ADHD? And as an example, right, when I was 4 years old, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and the first thing
Mhm.
my mum did, the doctor said, put him on Ritalin. He's got
Yeah.
ADHD. Mum said, no, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the way I speak to my son, rather than saying you're naughty, saying you're behaving naughty, things like that. I'm going to take him off sugars and feed him different foods. And she saw my
Yep.
behavior change within a week. So I guess
Good
where does
on
the
her. Yes.
yeah, super proud I'm doing that. Really
Good
amazing
on
job.
her. Good on her. I mean, the word that I've heard used is concretizing. So,
Concretizing.
hang on, I'll come back to concretizing. I think whenever we have diagnostic language or labeling language, we need to, even if we think it's helpful, we should hold it very lightly. And I tell my clients this: okay, so you've got this diagnosis, or you meet the criteria for this disorder, or depression, or whatever it might be, or PTSD or something else. Let's now hold that really lightly. I know a diagnosis can be useful because you can see yourself through a more compassionate lens. Once you have a diagnosis, that's sometimes true, but let's hold it really lightly. And then let's sometimes park it and, drop the label. And concretizing it means that, you know, kind of like acting it out. So taking medication would be a way of concretizing
So
an
concretize,
idea.
make an idea or concept real, give specific or definite form to.
Yeah. So, like, once you do transgender medicine, like sex reassignment surgery on a person, you can't go back. You have concretized something that
Quite literally.
might not have, quite literally, that might not have actually needed to be concretized. Like in the case of the interview Andrew Gold did with that man, he was gay, he regretted the surgery, and he concretized his gender dysphoria through hormones and surgery. But even taking medication is a way of concretizing it. Like, I must have ADHD because I'm on stimulant medication, and now I'm not against medication or surgery or anything. I just think what we're talking about here is critical thinking, right? And if we can avoid concretizing something, because I have a child with ADHD and we're delaying putting her on stimulant medication for the same reason, I think, as your mum was wary and wanted to delay that. Because what if we can find like medicalizing something is a way of concretizing it. And I think because of what we're talking about before, the fast pace, like Google will answer questions that we could never answer before we had Google. Right? And sometimes the answers are very questionable. But it's amazing to me that I can look up, I'm chatting with a friend and we kind of go, what's the capital of Bulgaria, or whatever it might. That's not a
Mm.
real example, but you can find that out in 4 seconds now through your phone. Given how we don't have to delay gratification anymore, we're very prone to wanting to concretize everything and fix it and solve it. And we've gotten so, going back to what we were saying, we're not good at holding space. We're not good at tolerating not knowing. We're not good at sitting with ambiguity. And that's had a negative effect on our curiosity and our ability to delay gratification, and really important, elements of a healthy human as well as a healthy human society. So it sounds a bit depressing, but I'm hoping that there's a bit of a backlash coming, which has applied some critical thinking to these issues. And we're talking about it right now, Luke. So
Precisely.
good.
So with your practice there for the last 20 plus years, or not the practice, but being a psychologist, is there anything that, when I ask this question, that comes up that you feel a lot of people might be missing, that you've seen the same pattern over and over again in people, the same thing people do, the same mistakes they make? Is there anything that, can you save someone 20 years of hearing other people's
Mhm.
problems and finding solutions and what they might be?
I wish I could answer that with one sentence and say, here's the magic bullet of all magic bullets. But I
Hmm.
think it's actually the truth of the answer to that question is there are multiple sources, multiple wells from which we can draw practices and wisdom. One of them, one of my answers though, is what you said before about, or you touched on about meditation. Any kind of mindfulness based practice and or body based practice that interests you, I would say get into it ASAP. It might not be meditation, it might be something else, but something that slows you down. It could be yoga, it could be painting, it could be,
Basket
but
weaving.
it won't involve scrolling social media. um, because uh, what happens when our physiology is more aroused and working hard, not getting enough sleep, scrolling social media, there's all sorts of things that we do that will elevate our physiology. What will happen then is if we feel a feeling like anxiety, irritability, sadness, we'll do something called emotional reasoning, where we've all done this, we assume that the world is as we feel it to be. So I feel angry, it must be because other people have done something wrong. I feel guilty, it must be because I've done something wrong. I feel anxious, it must mean something bad is happening or is going to happen. And what we do is, when we're not practicing some calming, mindful practice regularly, the feelings will turn into thinking and we'll end up in these cognitive distortions. This is basic cognitive behavior therapy stuff, but I think it's just so universally true. Like, you're saying some things are just true. And I don't know many things to be true, but I know this to be true. The mind is a trickster. One of my clients said, my mind can be a lying piece of shit. Sorry to swear, but I laugh because I'm like, everybody's mind can be a lying piece of shit when you're tired, depressed, anxious, stressed. And so I think if there's one thing I'd say is find ways to come back into your body so that you realize your distorted, stressful, negative thinking is merely a symptom of your physical and emotional state. Manage your physical and emotional state. Accept what's taking place. If you feel anxious or sadness or something really difficult like despair, let yourself find a way to sit with that and stay with that. Because one thing I know is the more we're able to stay with our feelings, be with them and open up to them and apply some curiosity to them, they kind of will take care of themselves. But if we allow those feelings to turn into thinking and all the cognitive distortions that go with that, and people can look up the term cognitive distortions, there'll be heaps on Wikipedia, then you feed the emotions, you fuel the suffering with your mind. So we have to find a way to get out of our heads. There's so many ways to get out of your head, but I think meditation practices, like you, I've tried multiple, places and teachers and practices for meditation. And it's really, when I stop doing it for a while, I suffer. And when I pick it up again, life gets better. So that's one of my big answers. And get enough sleep. I think a lot of people aren't getting enough good quality sleep. And I'm one of them right now. And I'm paying attention to how, when my brain doesn't get to take out the rubbish, which is what it does when you sleep, that, you end up more depressed, anxious, stressed, just because you're tired. You might not even realize you're tired. So that's my big answer to your great question.
And on the sleep part, the huge temptation is to become perfectionistic about it. And
Yes.
realistically, sleep isn't, it obviously is, but I'm giving an example here of how it could be. Sleep is something that happens, right? It happens.
Yes.
It is a biological function, as opposed to, here is my bedtime, 9 p.m. I wake up at 5 a.m. and I do this and I do that. If I don't sleep, there's something wrong with me. Sleep is usually a symptom, and because your sleep is bad, doesn't mean that your sleep is causing you to feel bad. And
Yes.
to be perfectionist about your sleep and to try and schedule it in is like trying to consciously watch your breath 24/7. It might help you to become aware of things in your body, but over time it will wear you down. So, and this
I'm
comes from
so
someone
glad you said
who's,
that.
yeah, and this comes from someone who has had lots of experiences with insomnia and who has gone
Mm.
through the whirlwind of CBTI, CBT, neurologists,
Wow.
herbologists, like the whole kit and caboodle
Have you?
of sleep
Oh my
stuff.
gosh. Wow.
Yeah, and it's like, so for me, and this is the reason why I do this live podcast, is because my nature is to be perfectionistic. And
Mm.
same thing with sleep. I regiment it. I make it this huge task that needs to be done. 9 p.m. I got to start winding down at 8 p.m. If I wind at 8 p.m., then I won't fall asleep. I got to stop. Have my last meal at this time. I got to wake up at this time. I got to see sunlight at this time. Andrew Huberman said to do this at this, and I'll trade rhythm. Next
Yeah.
thing you know, you are living your life under the control of sleep, when really
Upset
it's an
you
expression of your biology.
you're obsessing about sleep, and that's so counterproductive. Yeah. I think I
Correct. It's the
heard
same
Guy.
thing with anything else.
Yeah, I heard Guy Meadows. You probably would have heard Guy Meadows then if you've really looked into this, who wrote the sleep book. He said, sleep is like an orgasm. If you try too hard, it's not going to happen. Because,
100% right.
you can create the conditions for it to happen, but there's a way in which the body just takes over and it kind of has to just happen.
Letting
Like,
go.
yeah, sleep, you have to really kind of just like go and relax. What, because I've recently recommended a website called the Sleep Reset. I don't know if you came across the Sleep Reset, but it was developed by Yale and Stanford universities and gets really
Mm.
good reviews. I've recommended it to a couple of people. What did you find for you in the end, Luke, was the most helpful thing?
Honestly, it's niche in the sense of, so I'll go through a whole diatribe of this. So it, to keep it simple, I'll keep it simple at the end, but just I'll explain what's happened with me, right? So for me, it's been a combination of what works generally and then adapting that to my personality. Now, my assumption is that most people who have a hard time sleeping is that they're probably more higher on the neurotic scale than most people. And
Yeah,
neurotic not being a bad thing, it makes you sensitive to people, understanding how they feel and being more in tune with people than most.
exactly. Yep.
But does have its downsides, which means that your nervous system is on overdrive, right? It
Yeah.
means that, what a conversation might be to you will be completely different to someone else from a energy point of view and a nervous system.
Mm.
What do you call it? Nervous system effort level for another person. So my solution was to first and foremost understand what sleep is supposed to be and what is not supposed to be, and then my own personal foils around who I am and how I try and manage things. So when I first came into having sleep problems, like, okay, regimen everything, 9 p.m. in bed, 10 p.m. asleep, wake up at 6 a.m. and see light first thing in the morning, do this, do that, do the other things, and all these different mechanisms. Now, the underlying problem and the reason why I was having sleep issues is because I put so much weight on sleep. I made sleep
Yes.
the main thing that was causing me to feel
Mm.
shit about everything else. So sleep's the
Yep.
solution of everything. When I had perfect sleep, I just felt a little bit better. I just felt a little bit cleaner, a little bit more refreshed.
Yeah. Right.
And the
Interesting.
underlying problem was something else, like gut issues, or I was working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, burning myself out, saying, "Oh, sleep's the issue." It's like what you're doing is not normal. So a balance of understanding my psychology and who I am, so
Mm.
self-awareness when it comes to the big five and emotional intelligence, or four,
Yes.
being where you are, and then number two, the other side is around the mechanisms of sleep. So one example might be consistent bedtime. That's very simple. But for someone like me, a loosely consistent bedtime, a window of 1 or 2 hours typically, and then a same wake time around 1 or 2 hours. And then also letting your body take over. If I finish this call and I feel tired, it's like, well, I feel tired. If I have something to do, I have to do it, right? But lie down and get some sleep.
Yeah.
Relax. Let
Mm.
sleep happen to you. That's been my solution.
Great. I agree. Yeah, because once you make it, it's like people who obsess about food. I say to them, surely it's worse for your health to obsess about food than eat, a bit of sugar and carbs, right? Like, Um,
Absolutely. And then
the
splurging.
the thing that you think is the solution then becomes the problem.
Correct.
Uh, and that's so often, like that was the cycle I was talking about before. I've just made this connection, right? Critical thinking around an issue becomes a movement, and then the thing that started out as good critical thinking, people conform to that critical thinking, and then in itself that becomes a movement and a problem, and then we have to apply critical thinking to that thing. And it's a bit like obsession or addiction, where I've said to some of my clients who want to quit smoking or drinking or cut down, originally the alcohol or the cigarettes was a solution to a problem. They'd never thought about
Hmm.
it like that before. They were actually kind of sort of trying to solve a problem. And then the solution became the problem. And this seems to be the cycle of you go, sleep is a problem. Here's my solution. You get so obsessed with the solution. Now you have, that's a problem, right? And so it's kind of how do we get out of, and there's not just one answer to this question, how do we get out of that vicious cycle of solutions becoming problems? And I think it is by staying open, not fixating on things, but knowing that there's multiple, like I said before, when you asked me a question, I think there's always kind of multiple sources of support and of wisdom. And all of life is an experiment to see, and it sounds like you experimented to see what worked and what didn't work for you. And it was a multifaceted kind of approach that you had to take.
Absolutely. I have a question.
Yes.
What is an unconventional or different perspective you have on psychology and human nature that most people don't have?
Oh, good question. I think I touched on it a little bit before, which I think um, that mainstream psychology and mainstream therapeutic practices um, need to be critiqued, and critiqued at a kind of micro and meso level, but also critiqued at a macro level. I mentioned Abigail Shrier's book Bad Therapy before, I think, where she has observed that the language of mental health has been bad for some kids' mental health. Um, in that
Hmm.
guidance officers and therapists and schools have actually imposed their adult ways and approaches onto younger people. And yeah, in a whole, with good intentions, they have done bad therapy, which is the name of her book. And I think I've probably done bad therapy inadvertently, but I have no evidence of that. I'm just contemplating, um, in that I've imposed my ideas onto other people. And I'm doing my master's in Gestalt therapy at the moment. And it feels like the right time in my life to be learning about it, because it's very much phenomenological, which is this idea that experience arises, a bit like the Buddhist idea of dependent arising. The field conditions, if they change, then what we decide and how we behave, is going to change as well. So the idea that we've got to try to sort of take away all of our assumptions, and the things we think we know, and have a direct experience of this moment and this person. Um, and that's not what we get taught when we're trained as psychologists. We get taught manualized therapy. And to me, manualized therapy is imposing a set of assumptions, methodologies, beliefs onto a client. And while I can see the valence there and why it happens, because someone's suffering and they want an expert to take kind of some leadership on their behalf in their life and tell them what to do. And I get that yearning, like, someone tell me what to do, I'm drowning. Um, I think I'm different. I'm a bit of a heretic in my own profession, because I do question more than most, like, our training and imposing manualized therapies. I mean, I know I'm not the only psychologist who questions manualized therapy, but I even go further than questioning manualized therapy, like do it this way, step one, step two, and make a treatment plan, and like as if you know what's going to happen in someone's life. But I even question the principles underlying therapy, that we know better. And we have all this research and evidence and empiricism behind what we're doing, and that is true. I'm not dissing research by any means, but I guess I believe we should go back to some of the old school therapies, which were Gestalt therapy being one of them, which was very much about being with the client, holding space for people, feeling with them, thinking with them, inserting yourself into the therapy experientially, so that you're two human beings in a room. There's this famous psychiatrist who said therapy is just two anxious people in a room, which I always remembered and thought was funny and true. So I do believe that psychologists don't question enough some of the deep assumptions under which we're operating. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense, for sure. And I think every system needs a rejiggle every now and then. So that's huge. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you, or perhaps if someone's seeking therapy, where might they go to get help?
Yeah, well, my practice is called North Brisbane Psychologists. It's one of the biggest psychology practices in Brisbane. And I think the good thing about us being a big practice is we learn so much from each other, and our culture is so collaborative, and we do a lot of team-based care for families and couples and individuals. So people can find me through North Brisbane Psychologist, the Facebook page, the Instagram page. I have a YouTube channel. That's my website. Thank you. And if you go to the therapist's page, right up the top left-hand corner, our therapists, we have a range of really lovely therapists. I've handpicked them. If you scroll down, you'll see there's quite a few of them. And
there is indeed.
I'm happy for people to email me. My email address is on the website. I'm right down the bottom of that list. And people can email me and say, hey, I'm looking for a therapist. They don't have to be in Brisbane, because we do telehealth. So I've got clients in America and New Zealand and Perth and Sydney and all over. But they can email me and I can match them up with the right therapist. If they just want to follow us on socials, we're on socials as well.
Fantastic. Well, absolute pleasure to connect with you and have a chin wag, as we say here in Australia, and let's do this again soon.
That would be great. Thank you so much for having me, Luke. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Getting Mental podcast. If you like this episode, then you'll love this one here and this one here. Check them out.